I'm with Miri Nehari. Now, Miri, your father was one of the key leaders of Habracha. What is Habracha, and how did your father get involved?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. Habricha, in English, escape, meaning escape, is the movement of the Jews post-World War II. I'm taking you on a time machine back to 1944, mid-summer of 1944. Even before the war ended, areas that were freed from Nazi army, for example, in the Balkans, in East Poland, or in Italy, where the Americans had conquered Rome in the summer of 1944, Jews have started to organize themselves for two purposes. One, to help each other, and two, to think of ways, to find ways to go to Israel, which was at the time Palestine, Israel. And so it's amazing how people out of a war are organizing, getting themselves to finding the energy to organize and help each other and create a base for life, actually. So Habricha is a movement that was started by the Holocaust survivors, which I think it's a nice way to say they had to choose, and they chose life. They could choose to be victims, and they could choose to die. And many of them after the war said, what should I live for? There's nothing. They believed there's no Jewish people anymore. But they chose life, and they'd started organizing to go to Israel, to their homeland. They refused to stay, most of them, not all of them, refused to stay in Europe, which has become the great Jewish graveyard. Just to give you an example, in Poland, for example, there were 1 million children before the war, up to the about of 18. And after the war, there was about 5,000 children left alive. It's really horrendous. So the Bricha started, the survivors chose the word Bricha, escape, and they said, we are escaping from Europe, which we do not want to live in, and we are escaping to Israel, which we hope will be our country. We know that it isn't yet, but we hope one day it will be our country. Few months after the war, September and October, emissaries from Israel, actually earlier, people from Israel had come to Europe to help this organization. It was only a movement at the time, and make this movement actually an organization. First came the Jewish Brigade soldiers, Israelis who volunteered to enlist in the British Army to fight Hitler. And when the war ended, they had become, as somebody said, they changed from being soldiers of the King of Britain, they became soldiers of the Bricha and helped the survivors in any way they could. And then came emissaries from Israel. And so the Bricha is actually the journey of the Holocaust survivors, most of them, throughout Europe, first out of the countries under the Soviet regime, mostly to Austria and Germany, and then to the countries bordering the Mediterranean Sea, to where the Ma'apilim ships, the illegal ships, would try to take them to Israel, and usually they ended up in Cyprus, in camps, in British camps. So the Aliyah, the way to Israel after the war, has two chapters. One chapter is the journey by land in Europe, and the second chapter is the journey by sea from the shores of Europe to Israel, where the British usually stopped them from entering the country for different reasons. So there were about 3,000 people, men, women, and children, moving in Europe, some of them more organized, some of them less organized, some of them part of the way organized and part of the not organized. And they were transparent people. They had no papers. They belonged to no country. They refused to be Poles or Germans or Czechs or Russians. And they were still not Israelis because there was no Israel at the time. And it's like the exodus from Egypt. When the Jews left Egypt, it says in the Bible, they traveled and they stopped, and they traveled and they stopped. So they did in Europe, in the exodus from Europe. They traveled, all of it illegally. Then they would stop at camps, either Bricha camps or DP camps, displaced persons camps. When they were in the DP camps, which were organized by the armies, American, and mostly American, British, and some French armies, and under the ones that worked in the camps was UNRWA, its UN branch. They were legal. When they came into the camp, they were registered. They would register, and they were legal, and they would get food. Sometimes very little, like there were camps that would give Jews only 1,200 calories a day, which is not enough. Some would give them 2,000 calories, which is still not really, and that's after 5 years of Holocaust. And then they would leave the camp, one camp, going on their way to Israel, to another camp, and to another camp. On the way from one camp to another would be again illegal. For example, one of the problems of crossing borders was getting out of Berlin. Coming into Berlin was difficult because you had to cross, Poles had to cross the border, the Polish border, and then would go and come into the British Army zone. So they would have to cross the British Army zone border. And then Berlin was like an island. Getting out of Berlin was very difficult because they were transparent. They had no... Okay, so all this journey was crossing borders illegally, having forged identities. You would sometimes have... getting out of Poland to Czechoslovakia, it would be maybe an Austrian who's going home, and from Czechoslovakia to Austria, you would be an Austrian from a certain area going home, and then from that area would be an Austrian from another area, because you had to cross the border from the Russian zone to the British zone or to the American zone. And then you may be an Austrian trying to go to Peru. And for each one of those identities, you would have papers, because they were very good at making forged papers. And the way the traveling was many times by foot. They actually had to cross the Tatra Mountains from Poland to Czechoslovakia, always at night, very cold, very difficult. A real great project, I think, with children and with people who were just after the Holocaust, not always very strong. Sometimes you could cross, sometimes they'd use lorries, and then you could cross at a border station, formal border station, with forged identities. Sometimes they would have a list of a group. It was a group list of all the people who are crossing, and they would have to prepare the list ahead of time. So a man would be the husband of a woman he never met, and they would have a child whom either of them had ever met, and because the list had a family of a father, a mother, and a child. So they would take a man, a woman, and a child and told them, now, for this crossing, you're a family. Learn well your identities, because if you forget or if you get mixed up, the whole group will suffer, maybe returned back to where they came from, or sent, depending where it is, to prison and so forth. So the Bricha actually got this journey there was people to move, and there were camps to have, and there were forged documents to make, and you would have to find the way to where and how to cross the borders. That would be from the summer of 1944 to, we say, to the 1950, early or end of 1949, because that's when the displaced persons camp camps closed. Now, at that time, it's different from now. UNRWA at that time said a displaced person is just for 5 years. You have 5 years where we will help you. We will give you food, even if little, but some food and some medical care. And then after 5 years, you're on your own. Here in Israel, from 48, people are still under UNRWA getting, that's many years. At the time, it was only 5. So the war ended in 1945. By 50, all the camps closed, and there were no more refugees. Everybody had to find a way to live for themselves. So for 5 years, the Bricha actually was in Europe. For 5 years, all across Europe, except from England, of course, and Albania or so. There were Jews in Sweden also. They were taken, there was one Ma'apilim. Ma'apilim is people who came to Israel illegally on ships, coming from Sweden. So that's one more thing about the Bricha. Before I leave it, is the problem or the issue of children. That was very dramatic and very acute. There were children with no parents in the streets, in monasteries, and coming from the woods, coming from hiding places. So the Bricha, Jews always have their movements and they fight each other like parties. But on the children issue, they were all together, working together, coordinating the work to find. First you had to find them, then to save them. And then they had built, they called it children's homes, not orphanages, because they said, well, maybe we'll find the parents or somebody from the family. And there was a great thing to take care of children who have lived through the Holocaust. With all the people say now, how do you deal with something so horrible as the October 7th? And then they had to deal with the Shoah, with the Holocaust. How do you deal psychologically with the Holocaust survivors? No one knew. So the Bricha worked with those children, and they were taken illegally, sometimes walking, holding each other hands during the night, the babies with their mouths taped, not to cry. So that's something about the Bricha.